I'm here to introduce your next session. So we're exploring the roots of gang culture with investigative journalist Nicola and social historian Carl Chinn. So this session will examine historical injustices and contemporary issues that fuel violence and organised crime today. So let's welcome Nicola and Carl as they unravel these complex societal challenges.
Thank you. I always get a bit worried when I get a round of applause before I've said anything.
I know,
so thank you.
Wait to the other end of this. I wanted to tell you a story.
Yeah.
I was working a couple of weeks ago and I was going to meet a friend of mine after work. I was late. I had been busy with crime and I was kind of rushing across town in Dublin, where I live, and I'm coming across O'Connell Street. There's crowds and crowds. Dublin is always full of tourists, and on O'Connell Street they've put this thing, a big portal, right, which you can stream live into New York. So everybody heads for that. All the Americans who come stand and they arrange a time and they wave at their friends in New York. It's all pretty cool. Had to be closed down because there was a few flashers in Dublin and New York. So anyway, I'm rushing along and there's this kind of sea of faces coming towards me. And the next thing I see this guy, and he's in the uniform. He's in the Canada Goose jacket, the designer hat. He looks really angry, really aggressive. And, you know, the Balenciaga runners, the usual. And he's kind of coming and I'm going, shit, is he coming for me? And I sort of brace myself and then he sort of veers left. And he looks into, there's a storefront, a little corner, and there's 3 people sitting on the ground and they're sharing around this plastic bottle of sort of brown liquid. Right. They're unfortunates. They've bought whatever street drugs are available. And as I'm walking past, I hear the first crack as the hand comes down onto his cheekbone. And he asks him where his effing money is. And then there's a slap back of the head. And this is all going on at 5 p.m. on a Dublin street. It's all playing out. And I look and there's a second Canada Goose waiting for him on an e-scooter. And everybody rushes by and I put my head down and I rush by. And I go into the pub where I'm meeting my friend who's a fellow journalist and he's like, how's your week? I said, it was busy. He said, did you see the funeral this morning of James Jaws Byrne? This is a guy who heads up the Dublin wing of the Irish Mafia, or has done. He's the father figure of very significant criminals in Dublin. And he had been buried that morning. He died of natural causes. And his grandson had stood up and given a eulogy to him. And I just want to read you what he said about him. He said, Jaws, his grandfather, handed down his love and his morals to his extensive family. And I just thought that whole scene I had witnessed on O'Connell Street, it all made sense to me. This was what organised crime does. Those people, those unfortunates in the doorway, probably had a story of trauma. Yeah. Nobody chooses to be a homeless addict getting walloped across the face at 5 o'clock on a busy afternoon by a young guy who has another story. Canada Goose has his story, doesn't he? Where's he from and what has happened that has shown him that that's a career option? Yeah. And then you have the big guys, you know, celebrating the life and death, I suppose, of a man who brought his family to wild riches through it. And I just thought, isn't that interesting? Because that's modern day. That's what it's like. So it's nothing like the movies. It's nothing like the TV dramas. There's no glamour. And I suppose that brings us to you. Yeah. You're a historian and you have 35 books. Yeah. Remind me, talk to me later about how you did that. I find it difficult to do one. But you have looked at the Peaky Blinders and you've looked at, I suppose, the dramatisation of them, the glamour, but you know the real story.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's similar, really, isn't it, to what happens today?
It is. I think we'll talk about this later. Drugs has made a big difference. There's still backstreet gangs, postcode gangs, but they're involved with drugs on a lower level than the top boys, go right up to the top. But the real Peaky Blinders, the series has been an international success. It's a phenomenon. And it's supposedly about, notice the historical term there, supposedly, about a real gang called the Peaky Blinders from one district, Small Heath in Birmingham, based at one pub, the Garrison, at the heart of which is one family called the Shelbys. They're glamorously dressed, and as you say now, that fashion has taken off with lots of young men. Few women, but overwhelmingly young men. The reality was very different. It was brutal. It was not glamorous. There were real gangs in the early 1920s, and the first really semi-organised criminal gang in Britain was set up by former Peaky Blinders, and they went to war led by Billy Kimber. Anybody seen the series remember Billy Kimber? He's portrayed as a Londoner. He was a big burly brummie from Hospital Street, Summer Lane. He abandoned the story would be similar to yours. In 1910, he's moved from the ranks of backstreet Peaky Blinders because they've been put down by the police. With others, he goes pickpocketing and blackmailing bookmakers at racecourses. And there's lots of these little gangs from Birmingham, 6, 7, 8-handed. And he can bring them together in a formidable fighting force. And he wants to take over the rackets not only on the Midland and Northern racecourses, pickpocketing and blackmailing bookmakers, but down south, where there are more racecourses. To do that, he's very clever. This is why I see him as the first real semi-organised gang leader. Why I say semi-organised, it's got lots of smaller groups within it, with their own leaders. Much like a lot of the gangs today.
A lot of the gangs today can be fluid because they can all work together on one job, or else they can work separately, side by side.
So Billy Kimber moves to London, and he wants to take over the southern racecourses, which he does after the First World War. He's got his Birmingham gang with the Brummagem boys, but he also is very clever. He pals up. If you want to take over the racecourse rackets down south, you need London backup. So he pals up with the Elephant Boys from the Elephants and Castle, South London, the Camden Town Mob from North Birmingham, and the Garnhams from Chapel Market, is it, in Islington? I don't know if anybody knows it. I'm sure many.
And are they each bringing a separate skill together, or are they, some of them, are they all...
They're all hard men. Kimber is the brains, and that's what differentiates him. The others don't end up well off. Kimber eventually goes respectable, becomes a bookmaker. He abandons his Birmingham wife to live and die in poverty in 1926. She's buried in a pauper's grave. The worst indignity for anybody from the poor was to be buried you might have had nothing in your life, but to be buried in a grave with others was the ultimate indignity. Within days of his first wife dying, he marries his second wife, who is the sister of the gang leader from Chapel Market in Islington. Eventually, through her, they become middle class. He moves to Torquay, gets a lovely house over the bay. His 2 daughters by his Birmingham marriage live in poverty. His 2 daughters by his second marriage have ponies. They go to finishing school in Switzerland. I've got photos of them in Madeira on a cruise to South Africa. Now, he is the only real one of the ex-Peaky Blinders that makes money. His younger brother becomes a shopkeeper. He's also a member of the gang. The ones that make the big money in London are the ones that defeated the Birmingham gang in the racecourse war in 1921. So in the series, do you remember Darby Sabini, the Italian gangster, portrayed as a mafia-style don? He wasn't. He was born in Clerkenwell. His mum was English. He didn't wear mafia-style elegant clothes. He wore a flat cap and an open-neck shirt. But he becomes the prototype, him and his gang, for all later London gangs, leading up to Jack Spot just after the Second World War, to Billy Hill, the Crays, etc. And he eventually retires because his wife wants to become middle class. They move to Hove.
And of course, at that point, and the more successful they get, the more hands-off they can be. They're directing. They're like a CEO of a company.
Yes.
They have to do very little, and everybody on the lower levels are the ones taking the real risks.
I think the difference with this one is that when Sabini moves to the Hove, all the old gang books say he still run the rackets in London. How could he do that without mobile phones and computers? He didn't. Others took over his gang. And where they made the money, and this is what I think ties in more now, when the Birmingham gang lost Kimber as their leader and were pushed back to the Midlands, they disintegrated. They just go back to being thugs. Why? Because there's only one racecourse by Birmingham. There's no illegal drinking clubs in Birmingham. There's no illegal spielers, gambling clubs in Birmingham. Where are they? Soho. So when the Sabinis and their allies have pushed off the racecourse in the mid-20s, they have moved already into protection rackets. And again, that is the beginning of organised crime. So Sabini, I would say, with Kimber, he's a semi-organised gang leader. Mm-hmm. Sabini has a very tight gang of Anglo-Italians like himself, men of solely English heritage, pals up with East End Jews from Whitechapel. But behind him, and this is where, coming back to your point, is the Eminence Grease. The top man behind is a Jewish guy called Edward Emanuel from Whitechapel, who rises up from being a hard man, a really hard man, to running spielers, illegal gambling clubs for Jewish men, and he then moves on to the racecourse. He is the man behind Sabini to take over the rackets from the Birmingham gang and their London allies. He buys a big house in Golders Green. He marries well. He sets up a sporting printing business called the Portsea Press, making the tickets for bookmakers and printing material for bookmakers. I was a bookie. My dad was an illegal bookie before it was legalised in 61. My granddad was a legal bookie. We sold up in 84. We bought our racing material from the Portsea Press that was set up in 22 by the major gangster. He is the big gangster. And I've just got a photo of him from his great-grandson.
And of course, they've all been involved in all sorts of businesses and today are involved in all sorts of businesses. They want to ultimately legitimise themselves.
Yes.
To join ordered society. That is the aim if you don't get murdered or jailed. But I suppose let's have a little look at both back in the day and modern times.
Yeah.
What is creating this environment that criminals are coming to gangs? These gang leaders are not going out and finding it difficult to find lieutenants. No. And there's conditions there.
There are.
And they're created through social, even through planning of cities and where people are living, and ultimately through marginalisation. So take us back to the days of the Peaky Blinders. What was life like? How tough was it? How poor were people?
Right, so what I'm going to say here, I want to emphasise the majority of poor people were decent, hard-working, and they were the ones that suffered the real Peaky Blinders, along with the police in their streets. But there is no doubt in my mind that poverty is a major factor in turning some men into violent criminals. Let's look at the 19th century. It's a much harder world. In the tenements of Dublin, in the back-to-backs of Birmingham, the tenements of Glasgow, of the East End, there's no parks in the 1860s and 70s. There's no swimming baths. They've got no gardens. The street is their playground. And what happens is in the late 1860s is that the middle class are putting pressure on the police to crack down on street life. They want to take control of the street. You play on the street or a bit of waste ground. Young men gamble. They play rough sports on a Sunday, the Lord's Day. They don't like it. That leads to a reaction where a lot of young men join gangs to fight back against the police. And I think what we get out of that is there's poverty, there is hardness. So a lot of men, they're coming from very poor streets. They own nothing except this and their street. And so in Birmingham what emerges is street gangs, sometimes 3 streets away from each other, that are fighting each other to show off that they are the hardest.
And for supremacy.
For supremacy. In London, they're called street gangs from 1898. In East London, South London, North London, not all of those places, but in many of them, they're called a new word, hooligans. So the Peaky Blinders of Birmingham, who had disappeared by 1910, were the hooligans of Birmingham. In Manchester and Salford, you had the same phenomenon, the Scuttlers. In Liverpool, the Corner Boys. There's hard men and nasty men everywhere. There's also little gangs everywhere. But it's only in those cities, Birmingham, Manchester, Salford, East London, North London, parts of South London, and Liverpool, where you've got this rampant ruffianism that doesn't just show itself against the police. It bullies the poor amongst whom they live. They are men who beat women, they rape women, they attack Italians, they are racist, they attack Jews. So there's poverty, there's toxic, what I suppose we would now call toxic masculinity. And I'm not defending it, but you need to understand these things if we're going to challenge it. Why did they disappear? Harsh, tough policing, but also social forces organically. Churches and chapels are putting on youth clubs. Why don't flipping politicians, I nearly said something else then, why don't flipping politicians talk to social historians that study this? They're closing down youth clubs. They haven't got the funding in poorer areas. So what do the kids turn to? Then, before the youth clubs, it was the gang on the street. Now, youth clubs are closing down, the gang on the street.
For sure. And I suppose as the 1900s go on, a big thing that happens that makes, there's more money to be made there by the late 70s. Heroin comes.
Yeah.
The fall of the Shah of Iran. The rich people who are leaving cannot bring their cash, so they buy heroin and they come to Europe and sell it. And that creates heroin epidemics throughout, certainly my city, Dublin, throughout the UK and other parts of Europe. So the heroin is used largely by, again, disenfranchised people. These are hard times, the 1980s. There's a lot of unemployment and the heroin makes them feel better. So you've got one or two epidemics.
Yeah.
But there is a finite amount of people that are going to take heroin. What comes next is what makes the gangs really rich.
Yeah.
It's ecstasy. And ecstasy is taken by people who would never touch heroin because that's an addictive drug.
Yeah.
Ecstasy is the party drug. It's making everybody happy. And by sort of the turn of the century into 2000, all those people who have taken ecstasy, there's all this sort of population of recreational drug users who are not on street corners with a needle in their arm, who are business people who are out having a good time. And they're there. The economies of Europe and England and Ireland have changed for the better by 2000, and along comes cocaine.
Okay, yeah.
And what we have in the last 20 years is the rise of street gangs into multi-millionaire players on the global scene. They no longer would be building homes in England to bring their second wives and enjoy it. They go to Dubai.
Yeah.
They go further afield. Their global, organised crime has become something that is, as big now as companies like Google.
I think that is the big difference. If you look at the street gangs of Birmingham, Manchester, Salford, etc., in the late 19th century, there's no drugs. The most that these men are, except for the ones that move on like Kimber and Sabini, who have been backstreet fighters, but they move up. There's only a few of them. But the others, either they marry, they're hard men and they're young, they're part of the gang showing off, but they marry and the wife sorts them out and they have children. There's quite a lot like that, but there's a massive hardcore, but there's no drugs. And what they mostly do, they're not, I'm going to use this word, petty criminals. It's not petty for the people suffering, but it's seen in the eyes of the law as petty. So 7 or 8 of them might go into a backstreet pub and order a round, and the landlord asks for it to be paid, so they smash the pub up. Before they started sending them down for 2 months for attacks on the police, 2 months for major attacks, our own bullying people, beating them up, they used to have to pay a £2 fine, 40 shillings as it was in my day. So what they would do, they'd go around the pubs, the little backstreet pubs, the little backstreet shops, intimidating the shopkeepers. That's not petty for them, the shopkeepers and the publicans, but it's petty in the eyes of the law. It's only a few that move through, and the catalyst for that is money. Making money. Some of the worst Peaky Blinders, the Sabini gang, the Anglo-Jewish gang of the East End, they're after making big money from the racecourses. But most of them end up blowing it. Whereas only a few move on. But that's the beginning of it, but without the drugs. The making of the money is their drug.
I want to talk a little bit about city planning, because it's important as well in the growth of organised crime. What you had was people living in horrendous conditions and tenements. And the tenements were there up until really the 60s, 70s. So the government start to build big housing estates, and sometimes they forget about the bits they promised, the shops and the schools and the football pitches and all the rest of it. And throughout the 80s and 90s, you have these sort of marginalised areas where they're just a breeding ground for what is coming, for these drug gangs that are coming, who need kids to hold their drugs. When they're street selling, they like them to be under the age of 16, 8, 9, to be holding the drugs, because if they're caught with them, they won't be jailed. They use stash houses where they'll have an empty apartment or something and they'll keep most of the drugs there and they only bring out enough for each sale. They use kids to intimidate people into paying their debts, like the guy I saw on O'Connell Street was getting a wallop and his jaw cracked. That was a kid, somebody's child, who had been plucked by a gang leader, essentially. Yeah. They go for the vulnerable kids. Yeah. They go for the ones who are out in the street at night that the parents aren't out looking for them to come in.
And these are the ones that are being abused by the drug dealers and have been left out by society.
Exactly.
And they fall into that then. They collapse into it.
And we have created these, you know, by bad planning, I would think, as well, these very large areas which are just this breeding ground where if you're living, you're suffering the consequences of it, and also your kid is going out to school every morning and you're hoping to God they stay on the right path.
It's interesting. I think something remarkable happens after the hooligans, the scuttlers, the Peaky Blinders disappear, albeit that we get the growth of organised crime in Soho. But something happens, interestingly, in the 20s, 30s, 40s and into the 50s in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. Violent crime does decrease. And I see the major cause of that, not really the strong policing, which is very important, don't get me wrong, but the clubs, the social clubs for young people that were there. And also young men, particularly tough young men, boxing, playing football, outlets for aggressiveness. Now, that's not to say there still are violent men, I'm not doing, but there is such a lot. Birmingham goes from 1899, probably the most violent city in England, to the 1920s, one of the most law-abiding cities in England. And that's not just down to strong policing, by the way. It was a chief constable from Northern Ireland, a Protestant, Charles Rafter, who Major Campbell is loosely based upon, and his deputy, Michael McManus, a Catholic from Foxford in Mayo. So you've got the strong policing, but you've got lots of lads' clubs, girls' clubs, football clubs, backstreet clubs. Lads are playing football on a Saturday afternoon after they knock off work, on a Sunday, on waste ground or wherever they can. Now, what's happening in these estates... Would it be OK to mention one? Darndale. Would that be a perfect example?
Absolutely.
Sadly, Darndale's right on the edge of Dublin. It's cut off by the motorway, isn't it? From virtually everywhere. Got hardly any facilities.
And somehow they managed to build it in cul-de-sacs.
Yeah.
There's bloody cul-de-sacs everywhere. So even the police cars can't chase them through it because they're just constantly coming to an end.
And the good people, the majority living there, they are the ones that are feeling the wrath of these gangs. Because they don't care. In the past, in the 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s, before they knocked down the badly built areas, for all that they were badly built, there was a communal spirit, a sense we're all in this together. And that where women in particular, strong women, had a powerful role in the back streets. But that disappears with these new estates. People from all over are being forced in together.
Yes, the community is broken down.
Yeah.
And I did want to ask you about that. We did a walk, I'm sure some of you have done the Ripper walk in London here. It's very interesting, around Whitechapel. And they talk about this local sort of guy took to the streets and he brought the community with him. And they sort of policed the streets at night in a vigilante sense to try and find the Ripper and protect the women, OK? And we see that happening in communities, even when the drugs come.
Yeah.
There are people who are out there marching. They believe that they can, if they march in the house of the drug dealers, they're going to stop this thing. But of course, heroin was bigger than everybody. But where are the communities? And it's the breakdown of
those. That. And if you think back to the 80s, in the Liberties, the people in one of the toughest parts of Dublin took control and they were holding drug dealers off the balconies. Threatening them if they didn't stop. But then what we get is in Northern Ireland, the UDA, with Peace, the IRA, and down in Dublin as well, would I be correct in saying this? They are bringing real organisation. So you've got the drug gangs, but now you've got some of the former terrorists, or whatever words you want to use for them, UDA, IRA, moving into the drug game.
We've an awful lot of unemployed terrorists in Ireland since the peace deal came in.
And what's wrong as well, sorry to interrupt you there, the politicians don't care. Why? Because it's happening to poor people. In Birmingham in the late 19th century, Joseph Chamberlain bestrode Birmingham like a colossus. Not once through a period where there was this reign of the Peaky Blinders did he talk about them in the press, did he go to any funerals of the policemen that killed, or the bullies, the women that were beaten up, the women that were raped and killed, the Italians that were beaten. Not once did he talk about it. Why? Because poor men didn't have the vote. Mostly till 1918. They didn't matter. I'm going to look after the skilled working class. They'll vote for me. They don't live in these areas anyway. Sorry.
And it's really only funny enough when sort of organised crime tumbles into the ordered world that the politicians will stand up and there'll be crackdowns on crime announced. We had a very big blow-up in organised crime, which, is partly in that Cocaine Cowboys, a previous book I wrote about the Kinahan Mafia, they're the Irish Mafia. And there was an attack, there was a boxing weigh-in in Dublin in 2016, and the group had basically broken in two, which often happens. Most gangs self-implode before the police can ever get to them. And they had broken in two, and one side went for the other side. And they shot, they attempted to shoot the leader of the gang, Daniel Kinahan, but he jumped out a back window of this hotel. There was a big public weigh-in, and they killed one of his mates in the reception of the hotel, and everybody came out and there was a body. I mean, it was quite a shocking thing to happen in a European capital. It felt a bit more narco-style than anything. Of course, this event happens in the middle of a general election, and there's calls for the election to be put off. There's all of a sudden organised crime is massively on the agenda. This event is videoed and it goes viral around the world. And of course, Ireland looks as if it cannot control its gangs. So it becomes politically embarrassing. And then there's 100 million put in to policing organised crime and things start to change. But it's always reactionary.
What about Kinahans? Because the old man is not from the backgrounds we're talking about.
No.
He's a different, the leader of the gang, middle class, wasn't he?
Christy Kinahan Sr., a very unusual character in organised crime because mostly you can see the background, you can see exactly the path that a lot of these people come from. Whereas Christy Kinahan Sr., who's the leader of the Irish Mafia organisation, came from a middle-class background. He was the only boy in a family of 3 girls, and he was spoiled rotten. Spoiled rotten. And the mother ran a bed and breakfast out of their family's beautiful period home in Dublin. His father ran a taxi in the Gresham rank. He was educated, and he had everything. He's actually a member of Mensa, terribly intelligent, really good at sport, good at anything he put his hand to. So he chose a career in crime, in organised crime, and was a very ambitious guy and used his intelligence and all his skill sets. He enters it actually because he has good manners and a good accent. He actually is attractive to organised crime because he can sell whatever they've stolen into the businesses because he's middle class, he can fake checks, he can do that kind of thing. He's useful.
But he's using poorer kids.
Oh, yeah.
To do the dirty work. Mm-hmm. It's very important. My wife is a Dubliner, like Nicola. My wife Kay is from a very tough area in North Dublin called Finglas. We got married in 78, and within a couple of years, they were calling Finglas like the Bronx of Dublin. It went really rapidly, didn't it, Nicola? But my wife and all her family and all the friends and people that are still in Finglas, this is so important, they get really angry when their district is portrayed in such negative terms. And that's why we've got to we have to challenge the language that is used. They put a red line in the middle class around a district, and they decry it. So now we have the horrible terms like the underclass. In the 19th century, it was the residuum, the refuse, the sunken six. We've got to batter down that linguistic prejudice.
For sure. I just had a thought there about something else that's interesting. And of course, it's the court system, because kids go into crime and they find themselves
very good.
They find themselves going to court and then in jail. And of course, the minute they hit jail, your whole future is changed. You're going in a different direction.
I know we've got to take some questions in a minute, but just can I mention one point back and then I'll pass back to you. In 1874, a policeman was killed in Birmingham, PC Lyons. He was kicked, beaten, and then a young Irish brummie called Jeremiah Corcoran stabbed him in the back of the neck. Corcoran, and he was killed. And Corcoran was hanged for murder. Again, I'm not excusing it. He was criminalised by the system from the age of 8. They were sending young boys of 8 to adult prisons in the 1860s and 70s for what we called in Birmingham scrumping, taking apples off the trees of middle-class people's gardens. They were being sent down to adult prisons. What horrors are they seeing in those prisons? They are being brutalised from an early age. The state is brutalising them. They come from different... His dad abandoned him, and just before he died, he struck up a very close relationship with a Catholic priest. And the last letter he wrote, because he could read and write, it wasn't a kid who hadn't got ability. All these kids have got abilities. And he wrote to the priest saying, "Sure, haven't you been a better father to me than my own father?" In the papers at the time, there's a lot of anti-Irish prejudice, and yet the Birmingham newspapers were reporting that his mum was a hard-working, respectable woman. All the other children that she brought up on her own turned out to be working people, no crime. But one was lost. And that partial loss was caused mainly, I think, by the brutalisation of the state system, forcing him into an adult prison at the age of 8, then coming back, he's now marked, and he drifts into the street gang.
Now, of course, we don't put kids into adult prison anymore, but we put teenagers, 18-year-olds onwards, into prisons, and there are horrific environments, prisons. There was one criminal, I think he called prison his finishing school. Yeah. Because they meet other criminals and they have, they network. I mean, in prison. So if a kid goes into prison, they will come out a far more hard and experienced criminal than what they go in at. So there's a lot, I suppose, that can be done, that we're talking around, that we need to, I think, as a society. We look away when we see that incident on the street in Dublin when a poor drug user is getting a wallop for his bill. And we do, and we go on and we sit in our middle-class homes and we think, it's all happening over there, it's nothing to do with me. But actually, it is all to do with everybody in society. We all have to take responsibility for this happening. It's not fair or right to look away. And there are things, I think, we've discussed there briefly that can be looked at and should be done, and we should be calling for, is investment into community groupings, youth clubs, all of that. And
empowering local people. Not from the outside, middle-class outsiders coming in and we're doing it for the poor. No, let the working class do it for themselves. Provide them with the opportunity. There are so many talented people and they should be using the mums and the grannies, most particularly, giving them the power.
And identifying, I think, in education in particular, where is that kid going? Is there somebody at home? I mean, everybody... Policing should be the last thing, really, that happens. And it's where we invest most of our funds into fighting crime. Policing really is when they've committed the bloody crime. Whereas if you can get them beforehand and try and steer them in a different direction. And we talked about this, Carl. There is only a brief period of time that you need to protect a human being until they sort of get a bit of sense. And it's really from the ages of about 15 to 18, 19.
That's the last.
And usually young boys at that stage, when they hit 19, 20, usually they sort of get a girl or a boy or whatever it is they're into, and they start to sort of settle down a bit. It's actually all about the development of the brain.
And I think for me, sorry, we've got to go to the questions now, but for me, the biggest epidemic we're faced with is poverty. It's an epidemic that is shameful. It's an epidemic that is disgraceful, disgraces all of our countries, and it's an epidemic that will continue. At the last general election and those before, where were the lowest turnouts? In the poorest neighbourhoods of England, Scotland and Wales, and I would say it's the same in Ireland. We haven't had democracy. People talk about 1918 when women got the vote. No, working class women didn't get the vote until 1928. And yet within less than a century of the vote being extended, poorer people are so disillusioned that they're not voting.
They definitely feel they're being left behind. So let's open it up for questions if anybody wants to ask us anything at all. Oh.
Hiya.
Hiya.
I'm from Newcastle, up in the northeast, and we've definitely got an estate up there. I won't name, it's not fair. That's very much like what you've described. And there's people too frightened to organise as a community within the estate. So there's people organising around the estate, but they're not from there. Have you, in your research over the years, seen estates come back from such horrendous sort of background? So we've got murders in this particular estate, there's drug dealers and things like that.
Just quickly, from a historical point of view, a lot of the people in those estates would have come from Arthur's Hill, from the old west end of Newcastle.
That's the Jubilee estate.
Yeah, no, I said they would have come from there originally because that was the tough part of... But there was communal support in that neighbourhood. Coming back to the point that Nicola made, when they develop the new estates, they don't ask working class people. They tell you where they're going to put you. They don't ask what kind of housing you want or, what kind of facilities do you need. So I think we need to empower. Again, it's always outsiders coming in. They get all the funding.
I think what I will say, just go back to Nicola's point about that estate in Dublin. It's a city planning.
Yeah.
It's just rat runs. So the police won't even go in place.
No.
They get stuck against
the wall. Yeah.
So it's that idea of we can't overcome
without
knocking it down.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can knock estates down
No.
in the housing crisis.
Yeah.
And I think people are more afraid than they were before because of the firearms that are available. They are £2 a penny. I could go out and buy a Glock in Dublin for €600 tomorrow. There are so many firearms. They no longer, the groupings will meet, mediate, solve a problem. It's just a bullet now.
Yeah.
The violence has increased a huge amount.
I think the difference with the postcode gangs, it's knives. It's knife crime. And the where with a gun you might miss, you don't miss with a knife because you're up close. And that's the danger with knives, even more than with the guns.
You've had a big problem with that here in England.
Yeah.
I think it's growing at home in Ireland, but...
At the back. Oh, you got one there, sorry.
It seems like that the answer, obviously I don't want to be simplistic here with it, but it seems to be like a good solver is going to be, as you say, like putting the, into the communities and getting these youth things in there. Do you feel like there's I don't want to say conspiracy or whatever, but do you feel like there's a thing from above that's basically like they don't want to make that change? And if it does seem to be quite an obvious answer?
Well, I just think that, it's sort of happened since the days of the Peaky Blinders and previous to that, to the days of the Ripper.
Yeah.
The poor aren't powerful, and the rich get richer, don't they? And the poor get poorer. It's just... there isn't enough commitment, I think, from governments to put the money where it should be.
I think there's several things that tie into the about poverty. Until the 1980s, let's take a city like Birmingham. No, Liverpool declined from the 20s and much of the northeast did with closing of mines, South Wales with the steel mills. But if I take Birmingham, my city as an example, it was booming until the 70s. And then what happens is it declines. So now, across much of the Midlands, the North, much of the south where it's hidden, Scotland, Wales, the working class don't matter anymore, particularly the poor working class, because no longer are they needed for work in factories or the mines. So they've got no influence, and because they've got no economic influence, they've got no political influence. And coming back to answer your question, I don't think they care. I don't think the elite care.
Hi.
Hiya.
I live in Liverpool now and I work in the field of child exploitation, and I agree with you that it's idle hands sometimes. That is part of the issue. And I agree with you about more local interventions. But what I would ask you is, how do we fight the criminalisation of children?
Yeah.
By putting in physical community interventions when there's so much of a pull and push factor and a lure from social media. Yeah. And digital exploitation. Yeah. I just wondered if there was, an answer to that, really.
Well, we've brought in some grooming legislation that is criminalising it to groom a child into a criminal gang. So it's difficult. I haven't seen it work yet because, how do you operate that? Does the kid have to give evidence? But it's something. The social media phenomenon is unbelievable. Everything plays out nowadays on social media, threats to people. How do you protect kids, when you're trying to get them away from gangs. Very complex stuff. I mean, maybe you have an answer to that, because it is very, very complex and it needs loads of agency.
I think you're right about the problem with social media, and that means really government should be acting against all these social media companies that are making billions upon billions upon billions, you know, stopping that content being put on. There's a funeral director in Dublin that films gangster funerals, am I right?
Mm-hmm, with a drone.
With a drone. And then puts it on his website.
It's like bizarre. And then they have cardboard cutouts of the people who've been shot dead, and they dance around at the after party with them.
Yeah.
It's just so bizarre. It's like something from Narcos.
And tying into what you've said, it's not just the social media, it's the portrayal of gangsters as glamorous men. And, you know, we all, you know, the series, and I'm not just talking about Peaky Blinders, all these series about gangs, the Don, the leader, is a flawed anti-hero. But like Tommy Shelby, he's kind to children. He respects the elderly. He looks after women. No, they don't. Except their own. They bully him. So we've got... That's why I wrote the books that I've written about the real Peaky Blinders, to ensure that there is a reality put forward. Enjoy the drama, yeah, but it's drama. When the first series came out, they were all saying from the series it was based on a real gang. I knew it wasn't. I've been researching this since the early 1980s. That's why they never come to me.
Well, last question at the back here.
Oh, yeah. And then I think we're out of time then, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, I'm from Solihull. Have you heard of it? Posh part of Birmingham.
The posh part. Which part, though?
Yeah, it's very nice. Not too far from Chumsey Wood or the gangs and that kind of stuff. You say about the Peaky Blinders and the gangs and that kind of thing, but there's terrible knife crime in Chumsey Wood, and the whole of the West Midlands.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Or
sorry, what was that last part?
I'll say, would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, the knife crime. I don't
like
think
Nichels or Sparkbrook, Sparkhill.
The knife crime is rampant.
You know the areas I'm talking about, mate. You know?
Yeah, I know them very well. Kingshurst, Smithswood, Chemsey Wood, Lee Hall, Kicks Green, Shard End.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Sorry, you're going to complete that. Great.
Thank you.
I'm Nicola Talent, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.